I really like Uncharted 4. It was one of my favorite games of 2016. It has a more personal story than the other Uncharted games, along with more relatable character development and riveting motion capture and voice performances. Naughty Dog had nearly perfected its third-person shooter mechanics, interspersing palpable gunplay with simple but fluid melee combat and satisfying platforming elements, all of which is easy to mistake for non-player controlled cinematics due to incredible production values and the seamless blending of cutscenes with gameplay, and remarkably responsive controller inputs with animations. Although there are definitely games with more interesting art styles and aesthetics that I deem more beautiful, Uncharted 4 has some of the most realistic animations and graphics of any game to date, with what are currently the most lifelike and least uncanny character models I've seen in a game. All things considered, I think Uncharted 4 was a great send-off for Nathan Drake and most of the crew. However, it does have some pretty noticeable issues, predominantly with its pacing. I feel it lasted 4 or 5 hours more than it should have, with uninspired copy-paste environments and obstacles towards the end. Something that wouldn't be as noticeable if the rest of the game wasn't so damn good. It seemed to obnoxiously push its ending further and further away, continually preventing me from witnessing the finale I felt I deserved. It just came across as sloppy in this final act, less thought out and intentionally designed than the rest of the game. Unfortunately, these last couple hours seem to compromise the entire package to an extent, no matter how good the actual ending was. And I think that's largely because it forced me to recognize that the Uncharted formula had become somewhat stale. While I still think that Uncharted 4 could be close to, if not the best in the franchise, I have to admit that very little about it actually managed to surprise me like its predecessors did. Perhaps one should expect Naughty Dog to stick to a formula once they nail it, but after The Last of Us and the leap to a new console generation, I guess I gained the unrealistic expectation of something more. And I now know that that's the problem. Perhaps there simply wasn't more left to do. Maybe Uncharted 4 did everything it could do to stay fresh, while still being Uncharted. Enter Uncharted: The Lost Legacy, which began its development plainly as downloadable content for Uncharted 4, but was later labeled a cheaper, slightly shorter, but nonetheless sufficient standalone Uncharted game in which players take control of fan favorite Chloe Fraser as she attempts to track down an Indian treasure with the help of Nadine Ross, a fairly controversial character who acted as one of the villains in Uncharted 4. By all accounts, even though the game is cheaper and shorter than the others in the franchise, Naughty Dog isn't lying when they say The Lost Legacy is a complete Uncharted game. Like Uncharted 1, it tells a smaller, shorter, self-contained story with fewer characters in what is essentially a single location. Furthermore, the jump in gameplay between 4 and this is like the jump from Uncharted 2 to 3. There are a couple animation changes to Chloe, but she controls and plays essentially no different to Nathan Drake in Uncharted 4, excluding her lockpicking ability, which we'll talk about later. Right off the bat, it should be known that The Lost Legacy isn't really concerned with reinvigorating the franchise. As much as it appears to expect you to gawk at its marvelousness the same way its characters do, it also somehow seems to perpetuate the notion that it knows it's not the next best thing. And ironically, that attitude was actually somewhat refreshing and attractive. That being said, there are a couple things about The Lost Legacy that I think make it worth discussing in a video. Hands down, the best aspect of The Lost Legacy are its two main characters, Chloe and Nadine. This is a pairing I actually found surprising when the game was announced, and it was certainly an interesting direction to take for multiple reasons. Number one, these characters hadn't been associated with each other in any way before. Number two, Chloe was sadly missing from Uncharted 4. And number three, both characters appeared to have a bunch of room left for development. And thankfully, this is an aspect of The Lost Legacy that is explored to a satisfying extent. The performances are top-notch, even if I find Nadine's South African accent slightly laughable at times.
I'm sorry I doubted you, Chloe.
You witness unexpected but believably conveyed characteristics of Chloe and Nadine throughout the progression of their unstable and unpredictable relationship.
Put her there. Jesus! What was that? I'm really embarrassed for you right now.
Chloe is no longer just a morally grey, more impulsive female version of Nathan Drake. I mean, she is partially that, but here she's framed as a bit more damaged. She's made more aware of her selfish tendencies and is fleshed out as a caring, empathetic individual. A few of my friends have gone as far as to say that she's a more compelling protagonist than Nathan, a sentiment I find difficult to argue with just based on how much more flawed she is. While not at the center of this story, Nadine gets some worthwhile characterization too. You get to see her without her mercenary army, as someone beaten down, desperate, and contrite, not simply an overpowering feminine force of nature to beat up Nathan. If I had to nitpick, I'd say that the persistent quips and sarcastic comments grow tiresome after a while. It's getting old. And I've come to register that maybe not every character in this franchise should have this personality trait in common, even if they all have similar interests.
It's messed up. That's family.
But nonetheless, observing these two grow as people and as a team is consistently enticing. And there are at least two sincerely emotional and beautiful moments involving them that I won't easily forget. I'd say this tale perfectly balances the seriousness of Uncharted 4 with the lightheartedness of 2. So the jump from intimate character development to bombastic action isn't as drastic as before. Although the plot itself is rather standard, there are a few unanticipated moments here and there, and overall the story isn't as predictable as it could have been. The game can also be somewhat self-aware, not to the point of parody, but it knows when to poke fun at itself and at previous installments. Additionally, I really liked the boss fights, which is rare in an Uncharted game. They're similar to the one at the end of Uncharted 4, except with one small change to dodging that makes them a lot less frustrating and a lot more intense, if not just a little bit too easy. The ending to the game and its mid-credit scene are both great. As I said, nothing is particularly remarkable with regards to the actual underlying narrative of The Lost Legacy, though that doesn't really bother me personally because, you know, small story, big characters and all that. That being said, there's a villain. He's well acted, usually calm but short-tempered. Him having history with Nadine makes things a bit more interesting, but when it comes down to it, he's just another smug Uncharted bad guy with a huge expendable army for you to kill while you race each other to the treasure. And everything that could go wrong along the way does. Similarly to Uncharted 4, there's a decent twist towards the end. In this case, where the two get wrapped up in something outside of their main quest, and Chloe shows how much she's grown as a person. I'm glad that my first playthrough of The Lost Legacy only lasted 6 or 7 hours, because it doesn't drag on for longer than necessary, and overall I believe it is a better paced story than Uncharted 4. Interjecting combat, cinematics, climbing, and the works at just the right moments so that it doesn't become a grind. That is, aside from an earlier portion of the game when Naughty Dog experiments more with an open world, something they haven't done to this extent since the Jak franchise. Uncharted 4 dabbled in the idea multiple times, but each of the areas in that game were not as large as the one in The Lost Legacy. In theory, this is a great idea, because it helps you feel more like a treasure hunter. You're given a physical map, which is quickly marked with 4 primary locations that you may travel to and investigate in whichever order you see fit. Along with those small hidden treasures sprinkled around like in every Uncharted, later you're given a separate set of optional collectibles to gather around the map, some of which are accessed by completing some kind of minigame. As I said, conceptually this is a great idea, but it quickly becomes apparent that this open world is far more shallow than it originally seems. It falls into the trap that most open world games do, where they feel the need to fill themselves with just boring, busy work. For the most part, the side activities are nothing more than tedious, and all of them come together to create one big, outdated collectathon, not dissimilar to what Jak and Daxter did back in 2001. The fact that Uncharted is about treasure hunting means this game can get away with this sort of thing from a story perspective, even though I find it hard to believe that such a magnificent lost civilization would have felt the need to create such video gamey challenges. I think it would have helped a lot if they weren't marked on your map until after you completed them, because that would mean the exploration is more player-driven and the world wouldn't seem so engineered by the developers. But whatever. As I said, at least these activities are optional, and I now know that the reward for completing all of them wasn't really worth it for me. Essentially, you collect a bunch of things so you can get another thing that helps you collect more things. Each of the primary landmarks you need to investigate in the open world are more exciting than the side stuff, with a decent sense of tension, in spite of the fact that nothing particularly unexpected can happen because you know you're just going to be returning to the open world. They tend to follow a similar pattern and become predictable quickly. There's some great puzzles as well as necessary and welcome, if not slightly forced, character moments during and in between each of these obstacles. But overall, the good parts aren't enough to prevent this section of the game from feeling like a long grind through a checklist. No matter how diligently designed and beautifully rendered the open world is to look at and occupy, its luxurious, organic exterior fades away to reveal something blatantly robotic after a while. Thankfully, the open world doesn't take too long to get through in the grand scheme of things, and it can go much faster if you just completely ignore all the side stuff. The game really picks up once it becomes more linear and directed, and at least the slowest part is at the beginning of the game instead of the end. Oh, sorry. It makes more sense for the intensity to ramp up over time. Plus, I appreciate the attempt at doing something different, and I like the way they've gone about having you navigate the open world, using the physical map I mentioned earlier. With no minimap and direction markers, most of your attention resides in the actual game world. You observe your surroundings more closely in order to ensure you're traveling in the correct direction. Unfortunately though, the repetitive scenery means it can be quite difficult to formulate a mental map of the world. As someone with a good sense of direction, there were still multiple times where I found myself driving by things I had already passed without any idea of where I was actually heading and how everything was connected. As a result, I ended up unnecessarily constantly having to switch between the map and the wheel to ensure I was heading where I wanted to. And this is a very slow process. There's a weird dilemma here, where the game's detail and intricate world works to its disadvantage. But all in all, you can excuse this as a nitpick. On a similarly superficial note, I will say that another reason I was somewhat disinterested in The Lost Legacy was its setting. Uncharted 4 is set in numerous locations, all of which are gorgeous and very well realized, just like this place is. Unfortunately though, U4 places most of them within its first half, with none of them overstaying their welcome, and then decides to have the rest of itself play out over a single location, being the jungle island. By the end of the game, I wasn't sure I even wanted to see anything green ever again. Regardless of the fact that there had admittedly been some variation in the vegetation and surrounding set dressing throughout the island. I know, 9 out of 10. Too much green. It's a silly complaint, but I think it's worth mentioning, because The Lost Legacy does a similar thing, with a brief opening sequence in an Indian city amidst a civil war, that then quickly transitions to that familiar green territory. Thankfully, the location does evolve into something more interesting than I had originally assumed, with towering structures and statues that you frequently traverse. The sense of scale in The Lost Legacy is awe-inspiring, and I think it may exceed anything seen in the other Uncharted games, without sacrificing the detail. The incessant green coating these structures doesn't go away, but everything feels more thoughtfully placed than most things towards the end of Uncharted 4. Needless to say, but I'm gonna say it anyway, the game is just damn gorgeous in general, with the same outstanding production values as Uncharted 4. Character models, animations, lighting, texture work, all of it is phenomenal. And somehow the game still manages to transition from really close up to really far out seamlessly. Aside from a few hidden loading screens, it also continues the Naughty Dog tradition of never needing to load outside of when accessing a save from the load game menu. At this point in time, there are a couple bugs, like a teleporting Nadine, but nothing that can't be fixed in the future. And if these issues aren't fixed, it's definitely no deal breaker, and you probably won't even come across them. As stated earlier, The Lost Legacy doesn't do much to shake up gameplay, with lockpicking being the only new mechanic they've introduced. In most games with this feature, lockpicks are a resource, and rushing the delicate process can cause them to break. Here, the challenge is instead focused entirely on it taking place in real time, and not in a screen separate from the game world. It's supposed to be about building tension, where you desperately struggle to find that sweet spot with the analog stick before being caught and shot at. This all sounds nice and simple, but effective, right? Well, it's important to note that the incentive for picking lockboxes is usually to get some kind of special weapon, like a silenced pistol, which obviously you can use to kill enemies without alerting anyone. Unfortunately though, lockpicking in The Lost Legacy only really works to its full extent during a couple more orchestrated moments, particularly when you're under attack by vehicles and need a heavy weapon to destroy them. Otherwise, on regular difficulty, I found it easy enough to kill everyone in the area without the pistol or special weapon, and then just pick the lock when I had as much time as I'd like. That is, if there were any enemies to begin with. So, I'd say the feature kind of becomes redundant unless you're playing on a harder difficulty and/or are specifically prioritizing stealth as a personal challenge, which could very well be the route you'd like to take. Lastly, there are some good playable set pieces in The Lost Legacy, something people complained were lacking in Uncharted 4. Some of them are just really cool looking button mashes and QuickTime events, while others give you just as much control as in previous installments. Either way, most of them are pretty effective at building up adrenaline and making you feel like a badass. I don't personally consider this a spoiler because it is seen in promotional material for The Lost Legacy, but feel free to skip to this point in the video if you don't want the best set piece spoiled for you. Alright, so I think it'd be hard to argue against the notion that the best set piece in The Lost Legacy is the iconic Uncharted 2 style train sequence, which combines the fully traversable train with everything from the Madagascar car chase in Uncharted 4. It's really complex and dynamic, letting you jump to and from vehicles, ram motorbikes, shoot, swing on ropes, etc. I'd go as far as to say that this has to be one of the best action sequences in all of Uncharted, and it was well worth trudging through the tedious open world section to get to it. And those are the main talking points I wanted to bring up in this video. I could have gone into more detail on the puzzles here, some of which are really smart and challenging, but I didn't feel like there was much more to elaborate on. In conclusion, I quite like The Lost Legacy. It tries to do some interesting things, and overall it is a good game that I definitely enjoyed playing, for the most part. The main thing The Lost Legacy proves is that you can have Uncharted without Nathan Drake. That there are characters within this universe with room for interesting development that you can build an entire competent game upon. I guess if Sony has to have more Uncharted, with or without Naughty Dog, The Lost Legacy is an indication that I'd probably still enjoy another one with Sam, Sully, Charlie.
Oh, come on, they're a right pair of arseholes. What?
Nadine, and definitely more of Chloe. But I'd much prefer for this franchise to end now with its dignity intact.
800 rupees, please.
800 rupees.
Because even a modest attitude isn't enough to save Uncharted from losing my respect and appreciation if these games start being pumped out any more frequently. At the very least, give me some time to miss it. Let me know what you think of Uncharted: The Lost Legacy and my current thoughts on it. Obviously, you're more than welcome to disagree with me. Otherwise, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you enjoy your day, and I'll see you all in the next one.